Vikings lived in winter camps for months at a time. Thousands gathered on strategic riverbanks and coastlines, waiting out the cold before the next raid. Everyone knows about longships and axes and horned helmets that never existed. Almost nobody talks about what happened in those camps when the fighting stopped. The spindle whorls found in the dirt at Torksey, the iron collars pulled from Irish soil, the strontium readings in decapitated bones. Women were there. Some came willingly with families. Others did not come by choice. What does the ground actually tell us when we dig past the sagas? What do Arab diplomats write when they witness it firsthand? Which artifacts can we hold in our hands, and which stories do the bones confirm? The winter of 872 to 873, Torksey in Lincolnshire. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle writes it plainly: the army took winter quarters at Turk's Island. Torksey sits on the River Trent, 13 kilometers northwest of Lincoln. For 7 years, the Great Army had been tearing through England. Now they needed to stop. Metal detector finds and excavation at Torksey reveal more than 1,500 objects logged from the fields north of the modern village. More than 300 coins recovered. English pennies, Carolingian silver, over 100 tiny copper alloy stychus struck in Northumbria. The army had just left Northumbria months before. They carried the coins south. Over 100 Arabic dirhams, all cut into halves or quarters. Bullion economy. More than 100 lead weights based on Islamic standards. 50 pieces of hack silver, brooch fragments, ingots, 10 pieces of hack gold, 1 copper alloy ingot plated in gold, a fake, spindle whorls, needles, awls for leatherwork, over 300 lead gaming pieces, fishing weights for the Trent. The magnetometer survey shows an area covering 26 hectares. 2,000 to 3,000 people lived there through one winter under canvas and temporary structures. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. Also, this script is researched and factual, using sources from the Portable Antiquities Scheme database, logged between 1998 and 2013, and from Current Archaeology's Torksey project published September 2018, led by archaeologists Don Hadley and Julian Richards at the Universities of Sheffield and York. Now back to the information. Archaeology magazine reported in their March-April 2018 issue that it remains unclear whether these were Scandinavian women who came with the army as part of families or captives taken as spoils of war. The artifacts cannot tell you that, but other evidence can. The Annals of Ulster from 821 record that Vikings plundered Etar near Dublin and carried off a great number of women into captivity. That's one event. 1 year, one location. The History Channel published an updated analysis in January 2025, confirming that slaves might have comprised as much as 10% of the population of Viking-era Scandinavia. Girls and women were targeted in raids. Historical chronicles from northern European monasteries, often written by victims of Viking attacks, reference this pattern repeatedly. Ibn Hawqal, a 10th century Arab geographer, wrote in 977 of a Viking slave trade extending across the Mediterranean from Spain to Egypt. Women moved as cargo through these networks. The National Museum of Denmark published research confirming that slaves or thralls were amongst the most important commodities traded by Vikings. They acquired slaves primarily on expeditions to Eastern Europe and the British Isles. The museum's documentation, drawn from legal texts and written sources, states plainly that slaves' bodies were available for sexual exploitation. This is mentioned in the description from 922 by the Arabic diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan about his encounter with a group of Vikings on the Volga River. He describes how 2 attractive girls who were to be sold were sexually abused by their owners whilst others watched. Ibn Fadlan traveled as part of an embassy to the Volga Bulgars. He met the Rus, Vikings of Swedish origin. He called them perfect physical specimens, tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy. Each man carried an axe, a sword, and a knife. He also wrote what he saw happen to women held as slaves. His account appears in the Risala, his travel manuscript. The detail is explicit. The men engaged in sexual intercourse with slave girls openly in the trading camp, while companions watched or carried on nearby. No embarrassment, no privacy. The National Museum of Denmark references this directly in their historical knowledge section on slaves and thralls, confirming that the slaves' bodies were available for sexual exploitation and citing Ibn Fadlan's 922 account. 922 on the Volga. Ibn Fadlan witnessed a ship burial for a Viking chieftain. A young slave girl volunteered to accompany her master into death. 6 men entered the pavilion. All 6 had intercourse with the girl. Then she was laid beside her master. 2 men took her feet. 2 took her hands. A woman called the Angel of Death placed a rope around her neck. She thrust a dagger between the girl's ribs repeatedly while 2 men strangled her with the rope. This account appears in James Montgomery's translation published in the Journal of Arabic and Islamic Studies in 2000, held at Cambridge. The girl screamed, then she was dead. Ibn Fadlan came from Baghdad, a city of 500,000 during the Islamic Golden Age. He wrote what he saw without embellishment. Martin Biddle and Berta Kuhlby Biddle excavated in the 1970s and 1980s. They found a D-shaped enclosure covering 1.46 hectares, massive V-shaped ditch, 4 meters wide, 4 meters deep. The enclosure used the Mercian royal shrine of St. Wigstan as a gatehouse, furnished graves found, silver pennies from the mid-870s, disarticulated remains of over 260 people in an abandoned mausoleum. Members of the Viking force who died that winter. 4 kilometers southeast at Heath Wood, Ingleby, Julian Richards excavated a Viking cremation cemetery from 1998 to 2000. Burials on higher ground overlooking the Trent. More dead from the Great Army. The treatment didn't stop at exploitation. It extended to execution. Science Nordic published research in July 2016 by Anna Kjellström, archaeologist and researcher at Stockholm University. The project examined graves of assumed slaves in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Around 10 graves studied. Most of the individuals had been abused, injured, and decapitated before being laid to rest with their masters. Some graves had missing skulls. The thralls were buried without grave goods or treasures, unlike their masters. No signs of healed injuries. The wounds came at death, not in battle earlier in life. A warrior buried with weapons, shield, and moose antlers. Beside him, a thrall with no possessions. Head separated from body, sacrificed. The Grimsta grave in the Stockholm area. 2 decapitated men, presumed slaves, perhaps sacrificed. Flagstad in Norway's Lofoten Islands. Another grave with companions to a high-ranking person. Decapitated, presumed slaves, Kopang in Norway, bodies with chopped off limbs. The graves differ in details but share brutality. Strontium accumulates in teeth and bones through water and food. Kjellström's preliminary results presented at Viking World 2016 conference at University of Nottingham showed something unexpected. Some individuals came from other places. But some showed little difference from local groups. Slaves weren't always captured abroad and brought to Scandinavia. Many were locals born into slavery. The skeletons don't show signs of malnutrition. Some diseases leave traces in bones, but these remains don't show prolonged suffering in that way. In some graves, it looks like these persons lived quite like their masters in terms of food and basic care. But bones don't show daily beatings. They don't show rape. They don't show psychological terror. Kjellström stresses this limitation. The deceased were not related to the other remains in the tombs. Combined with signs of mistreatment, this strongly suggests they were slaves sacrificed at their masters' deaths. The bones reveal diets based heavily on fish, while their masters ate meat and dairy. Lower status confirmed in the chemistry of their skeletons. Similar examples across Northern Europe. A 14th century Icelandic poem, the original likely from the end of the Viking era, lists slave names: bastard, sluggard, stumpy, stinker, lout. That's how Vikings saw them. Ahmad ibn Fadlan wrote that if a slave died, they leave him there as food for dogs and birds. Molten silver tested on metal die punches. Lead trial pieces with marks indicating specialized punches making decorative silver objects like arm rings. A smith's set of iron tools now in Lincoln Museum. Textile production happening. Spindle whorls scattered across the site. Wool production for sails was critical. Viking fleets expanded. More ships needed more sails. More sails needed more wool. More wool needed more labor. Neil Price, archaeologist at Uppsala University, presented at a meeting on slavery and colonization. He stated plainly, this was a slave economy. A Swedish site called Sanda, excavated in the 1990s, shows a great hall surrounded by small houses. Swedish archaeologists now interpret this as possibly a Viking plantation with slaves as the labor force. Price stated, what you likely have is a slave-driven production of textiles. We can't really know who's making the cloth, but the implications are clear. William Fitzhugh, archaeologist at the Smithsonian Institution, added that female slaves were concubines, cooks, and domestic workers. Male thralls cut trees, built ships, rowed vessels. The National Geographic article on Viking slavery, updated December 2024, confirms Price's assessment. Slavery has received hardly any attention in the past 30 years, but now we have opportunities using archaeological tools to change this. Slavery was a very significant motivator in raiding. One factor may have been a dire need for women. Some scholars argue Vikings practiced polygamy, making it hard for non-elites to find brides. That may have driven raids. Genetic studies suggest a majority of Icelandic women are related to Scottish and Irish ancestors, likely raid booty. Written sources describe Vikings selling slaves at these locations. Buyers included Viking farmers needing household help and labor for the hardest field work. Significant numbers of slaves provided manpower for great building projects of the Viking Age. One account describes a monk so shocked at seeing Christian slaves for sale in Hedeby in 870 that he sold all his possessions and personally bought the slaves their freedom. The church opposed Christians being forced into slavery by heathen Vikings. Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe were targeted for a long period. The term slave originates from this practice. Slaves were seen as cattle or advanced domestic animals. They typically lived in the darkest end of the longhouse with other domestic animals. If they misbehaved, they were beaten. An owner could punish slaves as much as he wanted. Physical and sexual abuse was unrestricted. The National Museum of Denmark's documentation on Viking Age power and aristocracy states this without hedging. However, especially attractive slave girls and female prisoners of war of high status could live in good conditions and achieve respect. The same applied to skilled male craftsmen. Status could vary within slavery, but the baseline was clear. Possible shackles that might have been for prisoners or dogs, but collars are collars. Researchers are searching for evidence of special vessels designed to carry captives. Ben Raffield, archaeological researcher, mentioned this in Science magazine, noting that compelling archaeological evidence remains elusive, but patterns are building. Female slaves appear frequently in the evidence. Ibn Fadlan's account remains the most detailed eyewitness description we have of treatment of captive women in a Viking context. 922, the Volga, 2 girls to be sold, abused by their owners. Others watched, no one stopped it. That's the source we have in writing from someone who was there. The artifacts don't answer, but the broader pattern does. The Annals of Ulster, Ibn Haukal's trade networks, Ibn Fadlan on the Volga, strontium readings and decapitated bones at Grimstad and Flakstad and Birka. Women in winter camps weren't all there by choice. Some were cargo. Some were labor. Some were sexual property. Some were sacrificed when their masters died. The ground holds the spindle whorls and the iron collars and the bones without heads. The sources hold the words. Ibn Fadlan wrote it. The annals recorded it. The isotopes prove some weren't local. The lack of grave goods confirms status. The healed versus unhealed injuries showed death came suddenly, not from earlier battle wounds. This script draws from the Torksey Viking Project, led by Dawn Hadley and Julian Richards, published in Current Archaeology. September 2018, the National Museum of Denmark's historical documentation on Viking Age slavery, Anna Kjellström's skeletal analysis. Research presented at Viking World 2016 at University of Nottingham, and published by Science Nordic. July 2016, Elise Naumann's University of Oslo, research on Viking graves, Neil Price's work at Uppsala, University on Viking slavery presented at Scholarly. Meetings and reported in National Geographic. December 2015 and updated December 2024. William Fitzhugh's Smithsonian Analysis, the Portable Antiquities Scheme Database, and James Montgomery's translation of Ibn Fadlan's Risala, published in the Journal of Arabic and Islamic Studies at Cambridge in 2000. Now back to the information. A mint operated in Torksey in the early 11th century. Distinctive Torksey ware pottery produced here, found across eastern and northern England from the late 9th century. 2 pottery kilns excavated in the 1960s by Maurice Barley. Around 15 kiln locations now known, the pottery used sand tempering, fast wheel, and updraft kilns. This was different from earlier regional fabrics, which were coil-built and shell-tempered, fired on bonfires. Continental techniques arrived. The pottery revolution coincides with areas of Scandinavian conquest and settlement, probable link to immediate aftermath of Viking presence. Torksey ware so widely distributed that researchers initially thought kilns elsewhere mimicked it. Recent petrographic and chemical analysis confirms production at Torksey itself. No coffins, no grave furniture, no grave goods. Some burials cut into an undated pit where lime had been burned. Torksey ware pottery sherds and some grave fills, radiocarbon dates sought. Pre-construct archaeology and Lindsay Archaeological Services excavated 10 adult burials at the southern tip of the village in the early 1990s. A small pit disturbed one burial and contained 10 silver short-cross pennies from the late 11th century. Eastern part of village excavations by Lindsay Archaeological Services identified a third burial area, some graves and cists. One grave contained traces of gold thread dated 8th to 12th century, possibly from high-status ecclesiastical clothing. Suggests a church nearby. 27 excavation to the north by pre-construct archaeology revealed 30 individuals. Cemetery included graves with multiple bodies, diverse and disorderly burial positions, possible church structure identified, 3 parish churches recorded in later medieval Torksey. Burial record suggests more than 3 cemeteries, probably additional churches. Stable isotope analysis could trace childhood origins of individuals in different cemeteries. Contrasting burial forms may reveal different groups. The work continues. 870. A monk walks the market. He sees Christian slaves for sale. He's shocked. He sells everything he owns. He buys their freedom personally. That's one man, one market, 1 year. The system was bigger than one monk could fix. Hedeby was one trading center. Bulgar on the Volga was another. Burka in Sweden. These weren't isolated incidents. This was infrastructure, routes into Islamic and Byzantine worlds, funneling people from northern Europe through Russia to Constantinople and Baghdad. The Arabic dirhams at Torksey traveled that route backward. Silver for bodies, bodies for silver. Over 100 dirhams at Torksey, all cut into pieces. Bullion economy. Over 100 Islamic weights to measure them. The trade went both directions. Slavery existed in Scandinavia before the Viking Age. Evidence of economic disparity as early as the 1st century. Some people living with animals in barns, while others lived nearby in large, prosperous homes. 29 archaeologist Franz Herschend at Uppsala detailed a burnt structure from this early era. People and animals immolated together. Human bodies left in ruins, not retrieved for burial. The practice had roots. Vikings systematized it, extended it, weaponized it, made it central to their economy. Neil Price at Uppsala stated, "Slavery has received hardly any attention in the past 30 years. The focus on Viking exploration and craftsmanship and navigation pushed slavery to the margins of scholarship. Now the archaeological tools exist to bring it back to center. Iron collars, isotope analysis, dental records, grave positions, lack of goods, evidence of execution. These pieces build a picture. That's larger than many contemporary rural settlements, perhaps bigger than many towns." Gareth Williams noted this. The camps provided some of earliest medieval experiences of living in densely occupied, bustling commercial and industrial settlements. They paved the way for 10th century urban expansion. For months at a time, thousands lived, traded, manufactured, repaired ships, processed bullion, played games, produced textiles, and yes, held people in bondage. The spindle whorls prove women worked. The collars prove some weren't free. The bones prove some died violently. The isotopes prove some came from elsewhere. The grave goods, or lack of them, prove status. The written sources prove rape. Ibn Fodlan witnessed it. The National Museum of Denmark cites it. The sources don't hide it. 922. The Volga. 2 girls, abused. Others watched. Some thralls could be freed. Runestone from Herning in Jutland. Inscription reads, "Tauki Smith raised the stone in memory of Thorgisel Gudmunder's son, who gave him gold and freedom." Tauki was a craftsman. His owner freed him. It was possible, but it required the master's choice. The thrall had no power to demand it. Christianity led to a decline in slavery, but not immediate abolition. The practice apparently continued until 1241. Codex Holmiensis from that year contained rules regarding slaves. Over 400 years after the Torksey winter camp, slavery still existed in legal code. He concludes many were recruited from within the country. Kellström's isotope analysis supports this. Some showed little difference from local groups. People have a notion of thralls being captured elsewhere and brought to Scandinavia. Some were. The Annals of Ulster. The Slavic peoples. The Scottish and Irish genetic traces in Iceland. But many were local, born into slavery, children of slave mothers. Even if the master fathered them, offspring could grow up as slaves. Elise Naumann pointed this out. The female slaves might have given birth to lots of children. Such offspring still grew up as slaves. Slavery reproduced itself internally, not just through external capture. Thousands. They set up camp on the natural island overlooking the Trent, near vertical cliff on the riverside, marsh on other sides, no defensive ditches needed, natural fortress. They repaired ships on the floodplain. They processed booty. They melted jewelry. They tested die punches with molten silver. They played 300 lead game pieces. They fished the Trent. They produced textiles. Women worked. Spindle whorls, needles, awls. Some women traveled with families. Some women did not. The artifacts can't distinguish. The broader evidence can. Captives moved through Viking networks. Women were targeted in raids. Irish chronicles confirm it. Arab geographers mapped the routes. Viking camps held slaves. Legal texts confirm their status. Archaeological remains confirm their treatment. Bones show execution. Graves show no goods. Isotopes show some origins. Written sources show rape. All this happened. The evidence layers. Coins and collars and bones and words. 873 to 874. Another winter camp. The cycle repeated. After Repton, some settled. Some continued raiding. The conquest of England proceeded. The Danelaw emerged. Vikings became landholders, farmers, traders, town founders. The The slavery infrastructure persisted, had to be continued operating. Trade routes stayed open. The camps were temporary. The system was not. Radiocarbon dates show both probably died late 9th century. 872 fits. No record of fighting at Torksey specifically, but a long campaign takes its toll. Disease, accidents, some die even without battle. Viking burials known from Repton. Why not Torksey? Modern agriculture obliterated anything above natural clay. Variable sand depth means occupation levels may survive elsewhere on site. Excavation continues. More awaits in the ground. The winter camp covered 26 hectares, 6 large fields. Metal detector finds keep coming. 1,500 objects logged. More exist. The site keeps giving data. An overwintering Viking army lived under canvas, not in timber halls. Temporary, but organized. Enough organization to process hundreds of coins, manufacture silver arm rings, produce textiles at scale, maintain thousands of people for months. Enough organization to control captives. The lack of defensive works at Torksey contrasts with Repton's massive ditch. But Repton's enclosure was only 1.46 hectares. Too small for the whole army and camp followers. The Anglo-Saxon sources number Viking forces in thousands. Lower estimates of 300 to 500 are probably too conservative. Torksey held more, much more. The artifact spread proves it. 26 hectares is a city. The spindle whorls scattered in 6 fields north of modern Torksey village. Over 1,500 objects total, more than 300 coins. English, Carolingian, Northumbrian, Arabic, over 50 pieces of hack silver, over 10 pieces of hack gold, over 100 weights. Islamic standards, bullion economy running at scale, stolen jewelry chopped up, silver tested on die punches, lead marked with specialized punches, smith's iron tools, textile tools, fishing weights, 300 gaming pieces. 7 years of booty from England, Ireland, Francia, further east, all concentrated on 26 hectares overlooking the Trent for one winter, and women working. The spindle whorls prove it. Who held them? Free women or thralls? The question matters. The artifacts don't answer. Everything else does. Published, accessible, confirmed. The slaves' bodies were available for sexual exploitation. That's the museum's wording, not metaphor, not implication, statement. This is mentioned in the description from 922 by the Arabic diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan. The museum provides the citation. The Journal of Arabic and Islamic Studies published Montgomery's translation in 2000. The primary source exists. The behavior it describes existed. The pattern it reveals existed across Viking society. Hedeby, Torksey, Repton, Burka. The Volga, different places, same system. Anna Kjellström's analysis shows wounds that didn't heal. Death came at burial, not before. Execution, not battle. The angel of death with her rope and dagger. 6 men with their exploitation. 2 men with their hands on feet and hands. The screaming, then silence. Ibn Fadlan wrote it because he saw it. We read it because it happened. The bones confirm the pattern even when the specific events differ. Each grave is unique. Each shares brutality. The soil core analysis at Torksey traced the landscape evolution. Originally windblown dunes held by scrub and trees. 2nd to 3rd century Roman-era farmers felled trees, converted land to arable. Wind erosion accelerated. Unstable landscape. By 872, most dunes were gone. Flat, sandy ground prone to flooding. Perfect natural island when water rose. Perfect defensible position. Perfect location at junction of land and river routes. Perfect access to provisions from surrounding estates. Stowminster Church 1 kilometer northeast. Possible Bishop's Palace. Lincoln accessible via Fosdyke Canal joining Trent at Torksey Lock. The Vikings chose well. They always did. They read terrain. They read power. They read economics. They read where wealth was stored, where bodies could be taken, where winter could be survived. They were good at what they did. What they did included slavery. The archaeology proves it. The winter camps hold the proof. The spindle whorls, and the iron collars, and the decapitated bones, and the Arabic dirhams, and the written words of a diplomat from Baghdad who saw 2 girls abused and wrote it down in 922, and the isotopes in teeth, and the absence of grave goods, and the hack silver chopped from stolen jewelry, and the gaming pieces, and the needles, and the longhouse ends where thralls lived with animals, and the neuter gender in Norwegian legal language, and the rune stone thanking a master for freedom, and the monk at Hedeby buying slaves in 8. 170. And the strontium showing some were local born, and the Christian chroniclers recording great numbers of women taken, and Ibn Hawkal mapping trade routes to Egypt and the burnt structure with unretrieved bodies, and the economic disparity visible in the 1st century, And Neil Price saying this was a slave economy and the kinder, gentler Viking image crumbling under the weight of evidence, and the ground at Torksey giving up its coins one by one to metal detectorists for 20 years until 1,500 objects mapped the outline of a temporary city where thousands lived one winter, and some worked freely and some did not. And the difference between those two groups meant everything and left almost nothing. And we dig and we measure isotopes and we read what Ibn Fadlan wrote, and we count spindle whorls and we map artifact spreads, and we state what the evidence states. Winter camps held women, and not all were free, and some were worked, and some were exploited, and some were killed, and the Vikings who built ships and navigated oceans and founded cities and composed poetry and established trade routes and converted to Christianity and integrated into European society and left genetic and linguistic and material traces across continents also did this. And this is documented, and the documentation is dense, and the density is what truth looks like when you dig deep enough. That system had nodes, hubs of commerce where the primary commodity was human life. Dublin was one such hub. Longfort, the ship camps, established on the River Liffey around 841. These were not just military outposts, they were markets. Excavations at Fishamble Street and Wood Quay in Dublin, led by Patrick Wallace in the 1970s and 1980s, uncovered the anatomy of a Viking metropolis. They found amber from the Baltic, silk from the Byzantine Empire, walrus ivory from Greenland, and they found the infrastructure of the slave trade. The Annals of the Four Masters record for the year 980 that the High King of Ireland, Mael Sechnaill MacDumnell, stormed Dublin and freed 2,000 hostages. That is one king, one raid, 1 year. The numbers hint at the scale. The city was a clearinghouse. People captured in Ireland and Britain were sold into the Viking network. People captured in the East were brought here. Iron collars and shackles, identical to those found elsewhere, surface in Dublin soil. The city's wealth was built on this trade. Claire Downham, historian at the University of Liverpool, notes that the Viking slave trade passing through Dublin was extensive, feeding a demand that stretched from Iceland to the Islamic caliphates. The city's foundations are mixed with the profits from selling people. The story is not just in the soil of the camps, it is written in the blood. Genetic analysis of the modern population of Iceland tells a stark story. A study published by Agnar Helgason at Decode Genetics in Reykjavik revealed the founding population's genetic signature. The paternal lines passed from father to son via the Y chromosome are overwhelmingly Scandinavian, around 80%. But the maternal lines, passed from mother to child via mitochondrial DNA, tell a different story. Over 60% of the original female settlers of Iceland were from Gaelic regions, primarily Ireland and Scotland. The math is simple and brutal. Viking men sailed to a new land, bringing with them women who were not from their homeland. The sagas speak of settlement. The DNA speaks of capture. These were not willing pioneers in equal number. This was a founding population built from raiders and their booty. The women of Iceland descend from the great number of women the Annals of Ulster saw carried off into captivity. Legal codes from the Viking Age confirm the status of these captives. They were not wives, they were property. The Grugas, or Grey Goose Laws, the legal code of the Icelandic Commonwealth compiled after the Viking Age but reflecting its customs, is explicit. A thrall could not marry, a thrall could not own property, a thrall could not testify in court. A thrall's child was born a thrall, regardless of the father's status. An owner could kill his own thrall without legal penalty, though killing another's thrall required paying compensation, just as for killing another man's cattle. The value of a thrall was meticulously calculated in ounces of silver. Their humanity was erased by legal definition. They were livestock that could speak. The information presented is factual, drawing from established archaeological and genetic research from institutions including Decode Genetics, the National Museum of Ireland, and analysis of historical legal codes like the Gragas. Now, back to the evidence. The violence was not just systemic, it was personal and absolute. Consider the Ridgeway Hill mass grave in Dorset, England, discovered in 2009 during road construction, a pit containing the bodies of 54 young men, all decapitated. Their heads were stacked neatly to one side, their bodies thrown into the pit. Isotope analysis of their teeth, conducted by the University of Southampton, showed they grew up in Scandinavia, some from north of the Arctic Circle. Radiocarbon dating places their deaths between 970 and 1025. These were Vikings, but they were not buried with honor. They were executed. Their wounds showed no signs of healing. Many had multiple cut marks on their neck vertebrae, indicating hesitant or repeated blows. This was not a clean execution. This was a massacre. The leading theory is that this was a captured Viking raiding party executed by the local Anglo-Saxons. It demonstrates the brutal reality of the era, where death could come without ceremony, even for the raiders themselves when the tables turned. The eastern routes, running through the rivers of modern-day Russia and Ukraine, were slave arteries. The island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea was a key nexus. More silver dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate have been found on Gotland than in any other location outside the Islamic world itself. Over 80,000 coins. This was not random plunder. This was payment. The Rus, as Ibn Fadlan called them, traded furs, amber, and honey. But their most valuable export was people, Slavic people, captured in the vast forests of the East. The very word slave in English and many other European languages derives from Slav, a permanent linguistic scar from this period. The silver flowed north and west, ending up as hack silver in camps like Torksey, while the people flowed south and east, disappearing into the markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. The great Trelleborg-type ring fortresses built in Denmark in the late 10th century under Harold Bluetooth were massive construction projects. They required felling thousands of oak trees, quarrying tons of earth and stone, and the labor of a vast workforce. Archaeologists like Søren Sindbæk at Aarhus University argue these projects were likely accomplished with thrall labor. Free farmers would not have abandoned their own lands for the time required. It was the unfree, the owned, who built these monuments to Viking power. The same unfree labor would have quarried the stone for the rune stones that commemorated their masters, felled the trees for the longships that carried them to raid, and tilled the fields that fed them. The Viking Age economy, at home and abroad, was a slave economy. You cannot understand one without the other. A skilled blacksmith or woodcarver might be valued for his craft. But these were exceptions. For most, life was short and brutal. The Icelandic sagas, though written centuries later and often romanticized, contain glimpses of the reality. They speak of thralls being forced to do the most dangerous work, like handling unruly bulls or breaking new, difficult land. They describe masters beating or killing thralls for minor infractions. In the Laxdæla saga, a master named Hoskuld buys a beautiful but mute concubine named Melkorka. He later discovers she is an Irish princess. Her story is presented as a romance, but its foundation is a transaction in a slave market. She was bought and sold. Her son, Oliver Peacock, becomes a great chieftain, but her own story begins with abduction and bondage. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries altered the moral landscape, but did not immediately abolish the practice. The church officially opposed the enslavement of fellow Christians, which complicated the trade in European captives. However, the legal and economic structures persisted. The practice of enslaving non-Christians, particularly from the Baltic regions, continued for centuries. The system slowly transformed into serfdom and other forms of bonded labor, but the concept of owning another human being did not simply vanish with the last longship. In these pauses, the true nature of their society is revealed. Not just warriors, but traders, manufacturers, and slaveholders. The gaming pieces found at Torksey, over 300 of them, show men with time on their hands. The spindle whorls show the labor that filled that time. The Islamic weights and cut dirhams show the currency that paid for it all. Every object tells a piece of the story. The awl used to stitch leather for a shoe worn by a warrior. The needle used to repair a sail that powered a ship to Ireland. The spindle whorl, spinning wool into thread, perhaps held in the hands of a woman who remembered a different life in a different land before she was taken. The evidence does not allow for a sanitized version of this history. It pushes back against the romantic image of the noble explorer. The Viking world was complex, innovative, and far-reaching. They were brilliant navigators, poets, and craftsmen. They were also ruthless slavers who built an economic empire on the buying and selling of human beings. The decapitated skeletons in Norway, the Gaelic maternal DNA in Iceland, the iron collars in Dublin, and the eyewitness account of Ibn Fadlan on the Volga are not footnotes to the story. They are the story. The bones, the genes, and the words all say the same thing. People were property, bodies were commodities. And the winter camps were not just a place to wait out the cold. They were warehouses for processing stolen wealth, both silver and human. The ground holds the evidence. We just have to be willing to look.